Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I am, of course, your host, Mr. P, and it is time for me to give you yet another review of one of the Netflix adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft's work. This time we will be looking at episode 6 of Cabinet of Curiosities, The Dreams in the Witch House. Now, if you watched my review for Pickman's Model, you would probably be under the assumption that the screenwriters are not particularly worried about being faithful to the source material. Of course, in this case, your assumption would be 100% correct. As though the previous episode was not bad enough, this particular episode is completely unrecognizable compared to the original story. I commented last time that I'm not entirely sure how many narcotics the scriptwriter was indulging in during the script writing phase. However, I'm sure that this one had enough piled around them to make Tony Montana look like an amateur. Not without coincidence, drugs and hallucinogens play a very key role in this story. Surprise, surprise. Anyway, let's get on with it. If you haven't had the time to listen to the actual story that I have uploaded on the channel, or read the actual source material, let me give you just a brief rundown of what happens. Our protagonist is a man named Walter Gilman, portrayed here by Rupert Grint, and was a graduate student at Miskatonic University studying mathematics and trying to connect his studies to the rumors that an infamous witch in the area had discovered ways to traverse from our dimension into some other unknown dimension. He himself ends up traveling to these places, haunted by the witch and her familiar, and down the rabbit hole he goes until the end of the story, which I won't spoil here because as many problems as I have with this episode, it actually does a very good job of showing his demise. He has a fellow student rooming in the same building as him, and that building is no less than the witch's old residence that had still been standing after about 250 years since the Salem witch trials. Anyway, as far as major plot points, that's really about all you need to know as far as background information is concerned. So, anyway, unlike the actual story, the episode begins with narration from an unidentified voice, later to be revealed as the voice of the witch's familiar, Brown Jenkins, or in this episode, called Jenkins Brown, for some reason. Laying on the ground here is, of course, a man who is supposed to be Walter Gilman, but considering the fact that his character acts nothing like his literary counterpart, nor does he share the same motivations in hardly any way, shape, or form, I'm refusing to call this person Walter Gilman, and I'm refusing to call the rat Jenkins Brown since that wasn't his name. Instead, this episode should be referred to not as The Dreams in the Witch House, but as Ron and Scabber's Magical Mystery Tour. Not only do I call it that because it's somewhat funny that Rupert Grint is once again in a rundown building that looks somewhat reminiscent of the Shrieking Shack, with a rat that happens to be an antagonist, and also because the song Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles was a really crappy song and just sucked so incredibly hard. So I figure there's a nice connection there to the episode. So in any case, the episode begins with a flashback to a time when Ron and his sister, who didn't exist in the story, so we're going to call her Ginny because why not, is at their home and she's dying of some illness or whatever. She dies and her ghosts come back moments later and she's dragged screaming out of the house into some forest by an unknown power, and that's pretty much it before it flashes forward to Rupert as an adult. Rather than being a graduate student, Ron Weasley is apparently working for some spiritualist society researching supernatural phenomenon in Arkham, and specifically, he's trying to track down anything that can help him find his sister. Yes, rather than being a mathematical genius presenting information on what could possibly allow people to transport themselves from one world to another instantaneously, he's still hung up on his dead sister. Because of course he is. Anyways, he and his friend Frank Elwood are attending some fortune teller seance sideshow kind of exhibit. I should also add that in the story, he and Frank weren't actually friends so much as they were simply fellow classmates, and the only reason that Frank was in the witch house was because he was too broke to afford anywhere else. This really isn't Frank either, but at least he's closer to the source material because he actually has a brain and tries to get Ron some help, so he gets to keep being called Frank. So anyway, we get some more detail about the fact that, Ron is just obsessed with finding Jenny after she died, over a decade earlier, and he just can't seem to move past it. Frank tells him he can't spend every last waking moment chasing after some ghost because, he's broke and needs money to afford things, to which Ron stamps off saying something about, oh, well, I guess it's just all about the money with you, isn't it? Ron is a moron.
That's true.
He then moves on to the Spiritualist Society headquarters, where he encounters a nun sitting there going through her rosary beads in a borderline panic. Now, in the original story, you did have a Polish tenant of the house named Joe Mazurowicz, who was especially paranoid about what was going on in Arkham at the time, since it was coming up on May Eve, or Walpurgis Night, and that was a particularly bad time of year for all sorts of witchcraft and demonic activity. Turns out that the leader of the Spiritual Society is consulting with the nun's sister, who has visions of the future, specifically as they relate to the witch house. Her loving nun sister, however, tells her that her visions are from the devil and to never speak to her again. Now, I do want to pause here very briefly and go over just a brief pet peeve of mine. I realize that the people who write these things are not what you would call Christian in the slightest. And I'm not Catholic at all, so I'm not really wedded to any sort of love for monasteries or convents. So, nuns and monks, not really my thing. To be quite honest, I think the whole idea of exorcisms like you would see in, The Exorcist or things like Ghost Adventures or anything like that is really kind of hokey and stupid half the time. And I'm not saying one should have a cavalier attitude when dealing with demon possession, if in fact that sort of thing still goes on anymore. At least the way that it was presented in the New Testament. But when you look at the New Testament, and when either Christ or the apostles were casting out demons, they weren't standing around in a panic, terrified of what was going on. They had an absolute conviction that with the power and authority invested in them by God, that in the name of Christ, commanding a demon to come out would be 100% effective. Now, of course, you do have the one story where the disciples had failed to cast out a demon, but as Jesus points out, they were doing it incorrectly because they had not been praying and fasting as they should. The idea being that they were trying to cast the demon out on their own power rather than through the power of Christ. In any case, at no point in those records do you see anything about the phrase, "the power of Christ compels you." But since that has somewhat entered the public perception of how these sorts of things usually work, it is what it is. All I'm saying is that movies like The Exorcist and anything else that usually tries to show demon possession really has a very sub-biblical presentation of what happens. All of that to say this. The woman sitting there, going over her rosary, panicking, and then tells her sister that, oh, well, your visions are from the devil, so don't ever contact me again, tends to show that she really has absolutely no genuine faith in God to protect her from anything of the sort. Again, I realize I'm nitpicking, but it's just always been an annoyance of mine. But don't worry, this nun is even far more stupid than this scene. Ron talks to his superior, who basically tells him that they're running out of money. He goes back to work as a bartender, and Frank is there mentioning something in the newspaper about a vegetarian Superman rising up in Germany, which is an obvious reference to Hitler. Now, I'm not sure if this was meant as a dig at H.P. Lovecraft, since Lovecraft was a bit of a fan of things like fascism, and he was a bit of a racist. I think even by those days' standards, he was kind of on the fringe there, if I remember correctly. But in all fairness, the news media did have a love affair with people like Mussolini when they first came on the scene, so I don't know if this is a dig at Lovecraft, or if they're just trying to be historically accurate with the fact that people didn't realize how terrible these men were until it's too late. Although I should add that even after that sort of thing started, you did have men writing for the New York Times defending Stalin when he was, starving the Ukraine to death, saying that no, the Ukrainians aren't dying of starvation, they're dying due to complications resulting from malnutrition, which is a fun way of describing starvation, but I digress. Anyway, Ron overhears some guys talking about witnessing a forest, which he determines to be the forest of spirits that he saw his sister get dragged into. So he goes over there and talks to them, and the subtitles indicate that the men are speaking Navajo. Now, here's another stupid aspect of things in the story. I taught history for several years, including American history, American Revolution, things like that. Now, I also happen to have played Assassin's Creed 3, so even if I hadn't taught history, I would have been kind of familiar with some of the major Indian tribes that lived up in the New England area. Now, if any of you know your history, or played Assassin's Creed 3, you would know that one of the dominant Indian tribes, and there were several of them up there in New England, but one of the biggest ones up there was the Mohicans. Now, it's possible that there were no more Mohicans here because, as we know, Kevin Costner was the last of the Mohicans, but that doesn't explain why the Navajo are up there, because I'm pretty sure that even today, most of the Navajo live in the southwestern United States. I don't believe that's just because of the relocation efforts of men like Andrew Jackson. I think they were always kind of from that area. The point stands, though, that the idea of the Navajo being in Massachusetts for some reason really doesn't make any sense. It's like the scriptwriter was thinking, what can I do? You know what would be really cool is having spiritualism stuff, and let's throw the Native Americans in there for some reason. But they couldn't be bothered to actually do the research to figure out what tribe would have actually made sense. And so they said, well, this is going around World War II, and the the Navajo were really influential at that time because of the whole Code Talker thing. So let's just use the Navajo. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I'm thinking too hard about it because obviously the scriptwriter didn't. So, whatever. Anyways, Ron goes and begs for them to give him more information. The guy says, yeah, sure, come with me, after making sure that Ron wasn't trying to just, pull a fast one on him or, extort him somehow. So they take Ron to some seedy bar, underground club, opium den, whatever. Look, I'm surprised at this point the author didn't say, you know what else? Let's turn this area into to Eyes Wide Shut. Let's do that. It's the only way this could have been dumber. The Navajo guy who's on vacation in New England decides to ask Ron if he really wanted to go figure out what was going on and see where the spirit forest was. And the way he does that is asking Ron if he wants to get high. I'm not joking.
You want to get high?
Ron, of course, agrees, because the one thing you always do is accept hallucinogenic drugs from a Native American that you met 5 minutes ago, suspiciously named Towley.
You want to get high?
No, we don't want to get high.
Okay. You sure?
Yes, go away, stupid towel.
So Ron takes the drugs and begins completely tripping balls and sees the forest, sees his sister in there, but before he can do anything, the tree from Evil Dead grabs him and yanks him out of the forest. He runs back and wakes Frank up in the middle of the night, babbling incoherently about the best trip he's ever been on, only to eventually have to reveal that it's because he was on drugs at the time. The name of the drug being liquid gold, not to be confused with liquid luck, which, as we know, Ron used when he was competing in a particular Quidditch match. Ron has really hit the skids at this point. I'll be honest. He ain't looking too good. The years of alcoholism and depression have really done a number on him. Anyway, he immediately starts talking about how he needs to score another hit because, of course, now he's a junkie. And Frank tells him to go pound sand, and he's not interested into riding the white horse or riding the unicorn, or whichever metaphor you want to use. I believe it was Ozzy that, when writing Mr. Crowley, said, talking about riding his white horse. So, pretty sure that's the illustration. Anyways, but you can chase the unicorn. You're never going to catch it. It's just how it goes.
Get him! Wait! Where's he going now?
You don't ever catch the dragon, Dad!
No! No, I said! I am your father! Put it back on!
Anyway, Ron goes back and scores another hit, and fortunately for us, the screenwriter did not decide to show how he earned that second hit for free. Anyway, he goes back into the forest, sees a painting of the witch house, and then runs into his sister, who is shocked that he's there. For obvious reasons, because, she's dead and he's not. So his sister tells him, hey, it was my time to go. And then she asks him, hey, did you ever, make it as a musician? Did you ever make anything of yourself, brother? And he says, no, because I've been obsessing about you since we were kids, like a healthy person would. Anyways, of course, he ends up getting dragged out of the forest again, but not before grabbing part of her nightgown and ripping off a sleeve, and ooh, surprise, surprise, it gets taken into the real world with him. Words are hard. Now, this is actually something that took place in the story in the sense of him taking something out of the dream world into the world of the living. But what he ended up bringing back in the story was way cooler than part of his 8-year-old sister's sleeping gown. Like, in the story, he went to the planet of these elder things, probably in a completely different part of the known universe with different laws of physics, a 3-sun atmosphere, a polychromatic sky, etc. He brings back part of a railing, and the statuette is made of completely alien substances that don't even exist on Earth. He takes it around to different universities, they do chemical testing, and it turns out that in addition to the known elements on the periodic table, there are elements that don't even exist on Earth, let alone anything they could have ever conceived of existing on the periodic table. But no, it's way cooler for him to bring back part of his sister's sleeve. Ron goes back home, does some research on the witch, Keziah Mason, who is listed as being an herbal healer in the late 17th century. As usual, she was just one of these witches that was just wrongly accused because, hey, she knew how to use medicine. It's not that, according to the source material, that she was a child kidnapping, child sacrificing, bloodthirsty witch who was involved in the dark arts, like quite literally. But what do I know? Now, on the show, she's executed and her body disappears, whereas in the original story, I know she's in jail. I don't know if she was about to be executed, if she was just in prison, but regardless, she marks some runes or some strange symbols on a wall and just disappears. The implication being that she has walked through our dimension into another plane of reality that we can't cross over into under normal circumstances. Which, of course, is the entire reason that Gilbert is there in the first place, to study that sort of thing. But all that gets thrown out because now he's just searching for his dead sister. Anyway, he goes back out to try to get support from the Spiritualist Society, only to be told that he's been kicked out, because even they think he sucks way too hard to be a member anymore. And rightfully so. So Ron decides that it's time to go sleep in the witch house, and he starts to have the titular dreams in the witch house. And of course, because these scriptwriters can't just leave things to ambiance and the imagination, they have to show all sorts of creepy blood-like stuff on the ceiling. Now, one thing I will say is that in the original story, part of the dreams that Gilman had were a phase where he would see Keziah and her rat familiar slowly approaching him, and then it would shift to the dreams where he was floating through these abysses of the space-time continuum and going into different worlds and all these fantastic scenes and all that kind of thing. The second half of those dreams are never depicted in this. Instead, they shift to the spirit forest, and that's about as close as you're going to get. That said, the way that they adapt the first phase of the dream to show the witch and the rat approaching Gilman in bed is actually really cool, even though Keziah doesn't really look like the description in the story. I'm totally willing to forgive that part, since the effect is very creepy and very well done. I think the flames in the eyes is a nice touch, even though technically she was never burned to death, but whatever. I'm more than happy to give credit where it's due, where it's actually good, and I thought they did a really excellent job on this particular atmospheric part of the original story. Now, unlike the original story, instead of there being a second phase of the dream, he literally just walks through a door in the witch house to the spirit forest, which I guess could be considered a second phase of the dream, but regardless, he meets up with his sister, who quite appropriately is asking him, why are you even here? Like, why are you coming back? Like, this is clearly not something good that you should be doing. Of course, Ron doesn't listen, and he's just insisting that he can bring her back to the world of the living because he was able to take part of her garment back into the real world, and apparently the fact that they're twins allows that to happen because it was in Keziah's research somewhere, even though we don't really see that so much. It's one of those tell, don't show things. So his sister tells him that, Keziah wants to get back to the world of the living as well. And so all of a sudden, Scabbers shows up, does some trash talking, quite literally rats out their location to the witch, who then chases Ron back through to the other side, but not before she catches him and rams her tongue right down his throat. Which, I mean, as far as first dates go, it's not a bad way to end it, I suppose. You know, getting a little tongue action there. Even if it is from a psychotic demon witch. But, you know, hey, beggars can't be choosers. And at this point, I don't think Ron's in a position to be making any demands of anybody. So once back on the other side, Ron and Ginny end up meeting up with their next-door neighbor, who just so happens to be, surprise, surprise, the sister of the nun that was at the Spiritualist Society, whose visions were of the devil. That one. She rattles something off about how Keziah was tortured and how now she's compelled to paint all the time about the witch or the witch house or something. Anyway, somehow she's able to tell that Ginny isn't supposed to be there because of some other painting she made. So turns out, to nobody's surprise, Ron bringing somebody back from the world of the dead is bad juju.
That's true.
Because Keziah will be after him for the foreseeable future. Again, Ron is colossally stupid.
No, you look like an idiot.
And as it turns out, in order for his sister to stay there, either she has to go back to the world of the dead, which means she can't stay there, or he has to die. Which, apparently, according to the paintings, also means that he will be dead by sunrise. It's been foretold. Now, at some point, you may be wondering, or thinking to yourself, I don't remember any of this happening in the original story, but you have not yet seen one of the most idiotic things the show has to offer. Fortunately, it's coming right up. So Ron and cursed child Hermione run up to the church to seek help from her judgmental, bigoted sister. Because of course you can't have a religious figure portrayed in any sort of positive light in these types of shows. The nun tells her sister to get out because she has no place in God's house, to which her sister says that not only do they need her help, but aren't all souls worthy of salvation? Because yes, it takes someone who is deeply connected to an evil pagan witch to remind the Christian of how they should be living. Nitpicking, I know, but it's so idiotic. Anyway, her sister's heart grew 3 sizes that day and decided to help them after all. Frank apparently shows up, somehow knowing that Ron would be there, which is never really explained other than that he needed to be there for the plot to happen. The witch shows up to attack Ron and kill him because she needs him dead in order to make herself corporeal again. And the nun starts screaming at it to be gone and to go away. And then, when the front doors of the church are thrown open by the witch, the nun yells out one of the funniest lines in the entire episode. Get the f*** out of my church! You know, I think we all remember when Jesus and the disciples were casting out demons. One of the things that they yelled at the demons was, get the f*** out of his body. Anyways, to show that the nun is not only incompetent, but completely ineffective as a spiritual leader, the glass window gets blown out, and she gets a couple of shards in the face, and she's down for the count. Ron is apparently compelled to crab walk across the backs of the pews towards the witch, and eventually gets dragged out of the church and back to the witch house. She starts speaking incoherently while choking him for a second date is really ramping things up a bit higher than I would be comfortable with, but, when a woman knows what she wants. Anyway, Ginny comes out of nowhere, takes the stabby thing out of the witch's hand and runs her through with it, because of course an 8-year-old girl would be strong enough to wrestle that away from an eldritch, powerful witch and use her own tool against her. Ginny's spirit disappears and Ron is sitting there with the dumbfounded look on his face, which really is the same look he's had on his face pretty much the entire episode, so nothing new there. As he's laying on the floor, Scabbers walks up to him, and then it cuts to Frank and cursed child Hermione sitting around talking about how nobody would ever know what they went through last night. And to be honest, I watched the episode. I still really don't know what happened to you last night either. Ron goes and lays down in the bed while Frank goes off and finds a small little alcove which contains Keziah's remains and a box that has the remains of her familiar inside of it. So this actually happens in the original story as well, though the time frame is a little bit different. In the original, this occurs after the events of, well, what's about to happen in the episode. Part of the roof collapses on the house is eventually condemned, and Keziah's remains and Brown Jenkins' remains are found in the rubble. It's sort of a final reveal at the very end of the story, but they do a very good job of showing that and showing the box with the remains in it, even if the timeline is a little out of sorts, but at least they got that part right. Now, of all the parts in the story they absolutely needed to get right, if they were going to include it, was the main character's death. Scabbers is pissed off at Ron once again and decides that the best way to seek his revenge is to tunnel up through his body and eat his heart, and then, taking a page out of the John Hurt playbook from Alien, burst out of his chest. Up until this point, Frank had shown some level of intelligence, but the fact that he's just seen a rat tunnel its way out of his friend's chest and then acts like, well, no, we need to get him to a doctor. He'll be fine. He'll be okay. We can still put him back together. It reminds me of in South Park when they fake Butter's death and his dad ends up digging up the casket full of splattered pig. And he's like, there he is. There's my boy.
There he is. There's my boy. Come on, Butters. Oh, Butters, you smell like bacon. Don't worry. We're gonna bring you back, son. We're gonna bring you back.
Yeah. So anyways, the Hermione points out the window and says, see, my paintings never lie. And then the sun comes up right at the last second, showing, oh no, he died right when the sun was rising. Anyway, it's really stated. So they cut back to Ron's bed after they leave. Scabbers runs up, makes some sort of comment about him saying that he told Ron he could never get away from him, which I don't remember that line in the episode to indicate he ever said any such thing, but I may have just missed it, because at that point I was just kind of checked out. And then he decides to tunnel back into Ron's body, take it over, reanimate the corpse, and then go frolicking around town, mistreating the homeless, and being an all-around douchebag, which is definitely not how the original ended. Incidentally, in the original, Brown Jenkins did tunnel a hole through Gilman's body, which was pretty brutal, and they do find the box of remains later on, but it's never really explained how that happened. But then again, I mean, you are talking about supernatural stuff, and he was a familiar. The implication at the end of the story is that after the house is destroyed, there is no longer any fear of encountering him again, which could mean that whatever was left of his corporeal existence was tied to the home, but maybe not. Who knows? Either way, it's left kind of vague and open to interpretation, but I mean, it is what it is. But as I said, if you listen to the story, and if you've read the story and you watch this, you would know pretty early on that this story had nothing to do with the source material. Why they even bothered calling it The Dreams in the Witch House, I can't even begin to imagine, because if you don't actually want to follow the source material, why bother? Just write your own story and call it something else. Don't rip off somebody else's title and attach their name to it. This is really the problem with a lot of adaptations, where they will take an existing property that they know has a huge fan base or a cult following or what have you, completely alter it to have their own message and their own spin on things, and then use that pre-existing fan base to prop up the new property. And there's a ton that they could have done differently with this. Now, I understand it may have been for budgetary reasons that they couldn't do the surrealistic dreamscapes, but I'm not even sure I buy that one. There was plenty of CG they did in this and throughout the rest of the series. I'm not even saying it has to be great CG, but just something that stayed true to the source material. The biggest thing is that they completely leave out the subplot about the Dark Messenger, Nyarlathotep, about him getting dragged along with Keziah and becoming an unwitting accomplice in human sacrifice. The fact that he couldn't fully remember what was going on in the dreams, and that there were that he was pretty sure there were probably other awful things that were going on that he just can't fully remember. All that's way more interesting than the character just being hung up on his sister's death and not being able to get over it and just obsessing over it, doing nothing with his life, and then just doing one idiotic thing after another. And that's the other thing. Many of Lovecraft's protagonists weren't just stultifyingly idiotic. Gilman was a gifted mathematician and came to some pretty amazing conclusions during his study. Incidentally, the only reference to anything like that, if you pay attention to the episode, is when he's reading the book about Keziah. It does mention at the very bottom of the page that she had entered the university to study mathematics. That's about as good as you're going to get. But again, this is just a colossal waste of an episode when it comes to adaptations. It's a complete slap in the face to anybody who loved the original story. I'm not even someone who loved the original years ago when I read it. In fact, I barely remembered anything about the story besides the rat at the end. But after going through, reading it, doing the narration, recording and all of that, it grew on me, and now it's one of my, it's one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. But as I said in the last video, anything was better than this, because this was easily just one of the worst things ever.
You're better than this. Yeah, I know. Everyone's better than this, because this is the worst thing I have ever seen.
Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to give me a like. You can thumb up me. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you liked. If you didn't like it, always happy to get feedback. I can't improve if I don't know what's, not working. And feel free to subscribe so that way you automatically get notified if I post anything else. But yeah, really helps me out. But till next time, you take care, and y'all have a good one.